I came across a claim the other day saying that humans had wiped out 60% of all wildlife since 1970. So I decided to search and see if that is true. If you search, you'll find all sorts of news headlines that say the same thing. The Guardian claims that humanity has wiped out 60% of animal populations since 1970, according to a new report. The Washington Post says 2 generations of humans have killed off more than half the world's wildlife populations. What is the report that these claims are based on? It's the Living Planet report, put out by the World Wildlife Fund. They put out this report every 2 years. The latest was issued in 2018. If you dive into the report, you'll find that these numbers come from the Living Planet Index. First published in 1998, for 2 decades it has tracked the population abundance of thousands of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians around the world. So this is the first point at which it's clear the original claim is not true. The original claim said that 60% of animals had been wiped out since 1970, but this report only tracks vertebrates, not invertebrates. The distinction between vertebrates and invertebrates is a meaningful one because about 95% of all species are invertebrates, and about 80% of all biomass is also invertebrates. So the claim that we've wiped out 60% of all animals on the planet, based on a study that only looks at vertebrates and not invertebrates, means the claim is already false right out of the gate. However, if it is true that 60% of all vertebrates have disappeared because of humans since 1970, that in and of itself is still an alarming claim, so let's continue looking at the evidence. The report shows different areas of the world and how much the populations have declined in those areas. The 2 most substantial are the Neotropical and the Indo-Pacific, showing substantial declines since 1970. So let's dig into the sources for those claims. The Living Planet Index is based on the Living Planet database, which has all the information on the different populations and species. If you dive into their supplementary material, there's a few interesting charts that might make you question the overall claims. The first is this, figure 3. These hollow bars here show you the total number of species in this particular class. So there are about 9,000 different species of birds. This lower number here is the total number of species that are included in the database. If you do the math by class, you'll find that birds have about 17% of their species included in this database, mammals 12%, reptiles 2%, amphibians 3%, and fish 4%. That means that 96% of all fish species are not included in this database, and 98% of all reptile species are not either. If you continue looking through these documents, you'll see the time series length chart. So to have the population data in the database, it needs to be over a certain period of years. The overall claim of a 60% loss of species since 1970 doesn't mean that all of the populations included have been studied since 1970. In fact, the vast majority of records are only between 2 to 5 years, as you can see here. Past 5 years, they start to tail off significantly. When you get back up over 40 years, the number jumps again. It's explained by saying this is likely due to a large proportion of time series stemming from long-term monitoring programs such as the North American Breeding Bird Survey. If you look into the data, though, these long-term monitoring programs are mostly done in countries like the United States or in European countries. There are very few long-term monitoring programs in the places where they claim the most biodiversity loss, such as South America. Another area of concern is their data sources. So they claim that the majority of population records are sourced from peer-reviewed scientific journals, and if you look at the figure included, that's true, but only barely just. Secondary sources are close behind. But of more concern than the peer-reviewed and secondary sources of data is this nearly 1/4 of the pie chart here, which has unpublished reports and other as their sources for information. They say specifically that other sources include expert judgments, other unspecified sources, and population records from an unknown source. Now, it's understandable that they're trying to get as much information as they can into this database. And when you have a good amount of information coming from good sources, then less good sources hopefully won't distort the overall results too badly. However, that's generally true about the overall conclusions, but when you start to get down into the specific conclusions, this becomes problematic. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. So in this document, they talk about current data gaps. They recognize that they need more data in specific areas of the world. What are their biggest data gaps? Well, the number one gap is in the Neotropical realm with freshwater fish. Number two is the Indo-Malaya realm with freshwater fish. If those sound familiar, there's a reason for that. The Neotropical and Indo-Pacific regions are the areas where they claim the most biodiversity being lost. And this is especially true of the freshwater data. They state that the largest declines in the freshwater data are seen in the Neotropics and the Indo-Pacific, 94% and 98% respectively. Well, those just happen to be the two places where they have the largest data gaps. So you have to wonder if the large percentage decline that you're seeing in those particular areas is strongly influenced by lack of good quality data. Note that in the section talking about fresh water, they state that there are at least 126,000 different species which live in the freshwater ecosystem. They also state that the total number of species represented in the Living Planet database is 880. If you go ahead and do the math, that comes out to 0.7% of all freshwater species are included in this database. Or to say it in the reverse, 99.3% of all freshwater species are not included in this study. I would suggest that if you don't have 99.3% of species represented in your data, that putting out graphs like this, which shows such a stark decline, are perhaps misleading. It's also important to understand that of the populations that are included in the Living Planet database, they're only including a few geographical locations on planet Earth. So it might be the case that a particular species of, say, freshwater frog has declined 80% over a certain period of years in a particular geographic location. But that does not mean that that species has declined 80% in total, because the study is only done at a particular location. Now, in looking through the database, there are some better studies that include data from not just one location, but from many, like all of Europe. But those studies are not the majority of studies being done. And when you look at the individual entries in the database, you find that they really only apply to a specific geographic location, not the entire species across the planet. And if you look at the material here, this shows you where the population data is coming from. Each of the dots on these maps shows a location at which data has been gathered at some point about some population. And you'll note by looking at it that there are huge gaps in our understanding of species populations on different parts of the world. For example, there's an immense amount of biodiversity in South America, but there are huge swaths of the continent which have no information about population size at all. This is also true in Africa, as well as massive portions of Asia, which have very sparse coverage. This is even more true of the oceans. Naturally, most of the data we collect comes from coasts. It's quite difficult to get good data out in the middle of the ocean, so this means that for massive portions of the Earth, we have no population data at all. Only a few dots here and there about a particular species. So remember what the original claim is. 60% of all animals have died out since 1970 because of humans. But the study isn't trying to say that. In fact, in the supplemental material, there's a direct question about this saying, does the trend in the Global Living Planet Index mean we have lost 60% of all animals? The answer is a bit convoluted, but ultimately it's no. The overall trend calculated represents an average trend in population change and not an average of total numbers of individual animals or species lost. This is an important distinction. It means it's talking about how much population sizes have changed, but not how much the overall number of animals on our planet has changed. It also means that the original claim is, of course, completely destroyed. The authors of the study themselves explicitly stated here. So we now know that the headlines claiming that 60% of animals have been wiped out since 1970 are false. But what would an accurate headline look like? Well, if you look at the report itself, it shows that there are 4,005 different species included in this database at the moment. Estimates of how many species there are on our planet vary, but one peer-reviewed study puts the number at about 8.7 million different species. If you do the math and divide the 4,005 species in the database against the 8.7 million estimated species that are on the planet, that comes out to about 0.05% of all species included in the study. Or, to put it in the reverse again, 99.95% of all species that exist on Earth are not covered in this study. So what would an accurate headline look like? Well, I think it would look something like this. Not nearly as interesting to read as before, but it is more accurate. Now, I'm just having a bit of fun here. It's not the case that we don't know anything about biodiversity loss on our planet. Humans are undoubtedly impacting biodiversity all over the globe. But just because a problem exists, that doesn't mean that it's okay for inaccurate information to travel all over the internet. In fact, when real problems do exist, it's even more important for us to have a genuine understanding of the scope of those problems so that we can take the appropriate actions.